last week we had my good friend John here, and he was he kind of took us through, as I told him, kind of the climax of the story when Lazarus actually came back to life, and we got to see not only the kingdom of God at hand, but we got to see the power of God working in a very real place in a very broken circumstance. Because I don't know if there's any time we feel like things are broken more than when you lose somebody we love. It just, say the least, it hurts. And I think even in the most stout atheist, I think there's a little corner of their heart that says it shouldn't be this way. This is not the way things were meant to be. And whether they think that or not, it's true. It was never meant to be that way. We were meant to be in paradise forever, wandering around the garden, picking up some fruit whenever we felt like it, and enjoying and walking in the cool of Eden with our Maker. It was supposed to be perfect. And it wasn't supposed to be death, because we had this tree of life there in the middle of the garden that, in some way, gave us life. And maybe that was just symbolic, and it was God's presence Himself itself. I don't know. Whatever it was, we were never meant to die. And so when Mary and Martha lost their brother, well, before his time, um, they were hurting. And so it's so wonderful to be able to see Jesus step in and bring something beautiful out of that circumstance, and just see how uh, He took that brokenness and He made something even better out of it. I know I've talked about this in the past, and I don't even know that I'm going to say the word right, but there's a I guess we call it an art form from Japan called kintsugi, um, where basically the idea is that there's some dish that's been broken, some piece of clay or porcelain, whatever you want to call it, that broke, and in order to repair it, they don't just get some more clay and try to bake it or something like that. What they do is they get gold, fill in all the cracks with gold, so you end up with this thing that is whole again, and it's good for use if you want, and in its own way, it's beautiful. It has these little cracks of gold, and I think that's a little bit of how the kingdom of God looks like in the real world. Is that we recognize that things are broken, but when we let God step in, He comes, He fills in all those cracks, He puts things back together, and suddenly it's not just whole again, it's more valuable than it was before, because of what He uses to fill in those cracks, which is Himself. And so uh, I thought that's a beautiful illustration of the way the kingdom of God works. And Lazarus' story is no different. I just got to remind you guys that really this came down to uh, the whole thing. Jesus let it happen so that His followers would get to see something amazing. Now, the part that really blows my mind is that apparently this wasn't even the first time that they had actually had someone resurrected. So the disciples have been walking around with Jesus, and He's done this 2 times before. And so you'd think they'd understand, that they would get it. They would be saying, oh, well, Jesus says this all happened that I would be glorified. You'd think that would at least be tickling something in the back of their brain, saying, hey, this happened a couple times before. Maybe He's going to do it again. But if they ever thought that, we never see any indication of it. And certainly, Mary and Martha didn't seem to. Now, they had the right words, but you look at what they're doing, what they're saying, because they pretty much, both Mary and Martha greet Jesus with the exact same thing, basically saying, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And so Jesus steps into that, knowing that these two ladies that he does love and care about, um, that they're feeling a little betrayed, because if he'd arrived in time, he could have healed them. And I don't think anyone's going to argue with the fact that being healed from sickness is better than dying from sickness and then being brought back to life. It's like, let's cut short a little bit of this process, shall we? At least that's the way my brain works. And so that was the best good that they could see. But just like you and me, the best good we can often see is not the highest good. And God's plan is just better, because it wasn't just his 12 disciples who believed. It wasn't just the disciples and Mary and Martha and, of course, Lazarus. It wasn't even just them. It was everybody. Well, just a lot of people anyway, because one thing I've learned is that you can have all the right answers to all the arguments. There are apologists, people who have studied philosophy, archaeology, physics, history, all kinds of things, and they know the best ways to handle the arguments that atheists or agnostics or whoever else will bring against Christianity, and they got a good idea of how to answer that. And they can usually, if the good ones anyway, can usually come out making it perfectly reasonable to believe in Christianity. So what I've found in numerous conversations I've had is that you can do everything possible to make it perfectly reasonable to believe in God, but it still comes down to a step of faith. There's got to be some doubt. Otherwise, it's not faith. It's just, well, that's the way it is. God could come down and literally show us, take us back in time and show us the whole of history and Jesus dying on the cross and what was happening spiritually. He could take us on a grand tour if that's what he really wanted to do. But because so much of life is uncertain and this world has a way of breeding doubt, he knows that what we've got to do is we've got to live by faith. Matter of fact, it even tells us that without faith it's impossible to please God. So we've got to believe. And that's what Jesus was aiming at with this entire event. He was aiming at people to believe. And so what we see in John chapter 11, at the very end of what my friend John was talking about last week. Let's see, where was it? Yeah, verse 45. Many of the people who were with Mary believed in Jesus when they saw this happen. And that's important too, because Jesus is always trying to spread the kingdom. He didn't want just 12 disciples and a few other stragglers here and there. He was looking, his goal has always been for everyone. It's his desire that none would perish, but that all would come to eternal life. So he's trying to give people every chance to believe that, even when he's talking with the Pharisees, even when he's having these clashes, these arguments, where literally his life is going to hang in the balance from possibly how this turns out, because like we saw back in John chapter 9 and John chapter 10, Jesus' conflict with the Pharisees left them eager to take his life. They had all the reason they needed to by the end of chapter 10. But even in the middle of those conversations, he's still saying the things that they needed in order to believe. Now, there's people who, when you talk to them, you can share a gentle word. You can tell them what it is you believe, what you've experienced with Christ. And And they're going to hear that, and they're going to be moved, and they're going to step forward and say, I want that in my life. And then there's going to be people who, you've got to go through the whole um, presenting reasonable arguments for it, or whatever else. There's different things for different people. But again, at the end, there's going to be some people who are going to believe and some who are not. And you can be gentle about it with some people, and some people you just got to smack upside the head because we're stubborn. I don't know if you noticed, but there's stubborn people here in this room. I'm one of them. But even when Jesus is dealing with those Pharisees, he's still trying to help them move from unbelief to belief. Even when he's saying the things he knows is going to turn their heart against him, it's the truth. It's the truth of who he is, that he's not just some prophet that they need to just listen to and maybe change their behavior. He's the Son of God who came down that they could believe in their heart of hearts, and that would change everything. That nothing would be the same for these guys ever again if they'd only believed. And they just wouldn't. So let's go ahead and read this passage here. Verse 45 in John 11 says this: Many of the people who were with Mary believed in Jesus when they saw this happen. But some went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the leading priests and Pharisees called the high council together. What are we going to do? They asked each other. This man certainly performs many miraculous signs. If we allow him to go on like this, soon everyone will believe in him. And then the Roman army will come and destroy both our temple and our nation. Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time, said, You don't know what you're talking about. You don't realize that it's better for you that one man should die for the people than for the whole nation to be destroyed. He did not say this on his own. As high priest at that time, he was led to prophesy that Jesus would die for the entire nation. And not only for that nation, but to bring together and unite all the children of God scattered around the world. So from that time on, the Jewish leaders began to plot Jesus' death. As a result, Jesus stopped his public ministry among the people and left Jerusalem. He went to a place near the wilderness, to the village of Ephraim, and stayed there with his disciples. It was now almost time for the Jewish Passover celebration, and many people from all over the country arrived in Jerusalem several days early so they could go through the purification ceremony before Passover began. They kept looking for Jesus, but as they stood around the temple, they said to each other, What do you think? He won't come for the Passover, will he? Meanwhile, the leading priests and Pharisees had publicly ordered that anyone seeing Jesus must report it immediately so they could arrest him. That's as far as we're going. You see this point of light in verse 45 when it starts out, and it says that basically that there were many people who were there who believed. They saw Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead, literally by doing nothing more than just calling out to it. He didn't go in there, perform CPR. He didn't, get the electric paddles, say clear, and charge him or whatever. There was nothing like that. I mean, literally, he just called to him. That's it. If that doesn't show power of God, I don't know what does. Because if you look at it, again, he did nothing. He just spoke. But you look at John chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 1. That's how creation happened. God spoke, and it happened. He didn't say, let me start working with these molecules over here, and we're going to make a sun. Now I can make this planet for my people to reside on. It doesn't do anything like that. He just speaks, and it happens. And that's the measure of his power. And honestly, I don't even think he needed to speak. That's the way he does it. And so lots of people, we don't know how many people, but remember that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived in Bethany, which was like literally just like 2 miles away from Jerusalem. So there's people who had left the city, who knew them, come into the suburb of Bethany and just try to bring some comfort into it. And they wanted to mourn over a loss. And instead, you see something miraculous, something they'd never seen before. And it's just amazing. And so there's people who believe. But at the same hand, there's this problem because not everybody believes. I, I don't get how that happens. I don't get how you see somebody who is dead, brought back to life, and you go on saying, yeah, I don't like this Jesus guy. I don't think he's all he's cracked up to be. And so they go running back to the people that they knew hated him and told them what happened.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but he was already dead for like 48 hours at this point or more.
He's stuck.
96 hours.
Okay, I wasn't sure if it was 2 or 4 days. So,
Four. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know the exact hours per se, but it was day four, somewhere in that ballpark. And that's one of those places where I love the old King James version of the Bible. One of my favorite verses in the King James is that when Jesus tells them to go ahead and roll the stone from in front of Lazarus's tomb, and they say, "But Lord, he stinketh." I love that. That's just the way my mind works. But anyway, um, man, with all that, there's still these people who just like, no, I'm sorry. This Jesus just can't be who he claims to be. They just saw somebody come back to life. That's not enough. Which begs the question to me, exactly what is enough? And the answer is for some people, it's there's nothing that's going to be enough. And so they went and they told on Jesus. Like some little brother going to mom and dad, except that, Jesus hadn't done anything wrong, just something that they didn't like. And they understood the gravity of it because remember, like I said, in John chapter 9 and chapter 10, Jesus is dealing with these Pharisees and he's having a big argument with them. And he basically told them that he was the Son of God. It wasn't just that he's a prophet, he's the Son of God. They understood perfectly what he meant, even though he didn't say it bluntly as I did. They understood exactly what he was thinking and saying. And so they were trying to kill him. So Jesus had to hightail it out of there. And so these people had all the ammunition they needed to want Jesus dead. But suddenly, this guy that they want dead, they hear about him bringing somebody back to life, and that people believe that basically the crowd of people who are dedicated to Jesus just grew by some number we don't know. Maybe it was a couple hundred, maybe it was five, maybe it was 5,000. I don't know. But we see this number of people that just were blown away and they believed Jesus for who he is. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the ruling council of Jerusalem, just gets scared. There's nothing else for it. And so you look at it, what does it say? Verse 46, but some went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the leading priests and Pharisees called to the high council together. What are we going to do? They asked each other. This man certainly performs many miraculous signs. If we allow him to go on like this, soon everybody will believe in him. Then the Roman army will come and destroy both our temple and our nation. So they're scared. And they're trying to raise, at least the way it works in my brain anyway, they're trying to raise some legitimate reason to justify what it is that they're doing. But when you stop and you think about it, Jesus just raised somebody from the dead. If he really wanted to kick Rome out, he could have. All he needs to do is get a small group of people who are dedicated to fight. It's like they go, they fight, Rome kills him. Jesus brings them back to life. They fight some more. They die. Jesus brings them. He can keep doing this if that's what he wants to do. He could conquer Rome, and there's nothing Rome could do. It would be an inevitable loss if that's what he wanted. It was perfectly logical train of thought. But the Pharisees couldn't land on that because in the end, it wasn't about what Jesus could do. It was about who Jesus was, and they weren't willing to give up what they had to give it over to Jesus. That's a problem. They had power, they had authority, maybe not as much as they wanted, because no doubt they wanted Rome out of it so they could have the complete authority. But they couldn't do it on their own. And so they were looking for the Messiah to come in and do things their way and kick Rome out and just lead an army, and that was the salvation that they were really hoping for. And that's us. That's us, because if we come right down to it, we're the ones who have this small idea of what we need God to do, of what it is we think is what we need the most. Salvation, if you will, in whatever form it looks like in your life. And so we go to God. It's like, hey, God, if you can just give me this, or if you can just take care of this problem, or get this person to, I don't know, move or something, or yeah, let them fire this coworker who's a royal pain in my rear end. And God's got bigger plans. He's got bigger and better. And we just settle for these small things. And that ultimately was a big part of what these guys had wrong. Biggest thing was, of course, that they wouldn't believe Jesus is who he is. But right below that, they wouldn't accept that God's plan was better. Now, how about you guys? That's something I do all the time. It's embarrassing how often I try to basically come to God and give him my advice. That's what a lot of my prayers look like, if I'm being honest. Hey God, would you please do this? Would you please do that? Because God, this just seems reasonable to me. This seems like the right thing to do. This seems the right way to go, whatever it is. And so I basically tell him. I mean, yes, I'm kind of doing it in the form of asking him for something, but I'm asking for it because I really do believe it's the right thing. And I don't think there's anything wrong with me telling him that and asking for what it is I think is the right thing. But in the end, if I don't say and actually believe, okay, God, this is my plan, but I want your plan. If that's totally different than mine, so much better. I trust you. And I'll go through those motions, but I don't know how heartfelt it is all the time. I'll bet you guys are probably the same. But these Pharisees, they're just scared. They're scared that they're going to lose everything. And if you know history, in 70 AD, Rome destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. So what they were scared about happening happened anyway, despite them trying to manage things the best way that they knew how. And it didn't have anything to do with Jesus. So, Caiaphas says in verse 49, that talks about him. Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time, said, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't realize that it's better for you that one man, Jesus, should die for the people than for the whole nation to be destroyed. He did not say this on his own. As high priest at the time, he was led to prophesy that Jesus would die for the entire nation, and not only for that nation, but to bring together and unite all the children of God scattered around the world. So we get this situation where Caiaphas comes in. He's the high priest, so like he's like the grand poobah. You remember your Flintstones of the Water Buffalo, Royal Order of the Water Buffalo. I know I'm dating myself there. I don't care. So he's chief priest, which means everybody has to listen to him to some degree. You don't have to agree with him, but in the end, his decision goes. He's been picked. If he's been in that position for um, very long at all, really, then you know to some extent that he is acceptable to God. Because if he weren't, there's a day in the Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement, where the high priest's job was to go into the Holy of Holies in the temple and to sprinkle blood on the stuff in there. And long story short is if he had to go through ritual purification beforehand. If he didn't do that well, or if he sinned again or something, if he wasn't worthy, in other words, what happens is that God would strike him dead there in the Holy of Holies. And so he went in with a rope tied to his ankle so that if he died, they could pull him out instead of having to go after him because they wouldn't be the high priest. They wouldn't be worthy. And if they went in, they'd be struck dead too. So if he's been in this position for very long, I think he has been, though I couldn't tell you how long. Um, Caiaphas has gotten something of a stamp of approval, or at least I guess I should say he hasn't gotten a stamp of disapproval from God. Um, and so God, the Father, tries to reach Caiaphas himself. And I'm just blown away because this is just us. This is just so you and me. Because he gave Caiaphas a message, and Caiaphas took it and twisted it into what he wanted it to. And that's what we do all the time. How many times do we take a verse, we pull it out of the Bible, and we make it mean what we want it to mean? My classic example is in Philippians when it says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Well, that's not talking about athletic events. It's talking about the ability to live rich or poor or sick or healthy or running for your life or living in luxury. Um, Either way, whatever circumstance Paul found himself in, he's saying, I can do all that through Christ who strengthens me. So no matter what kind of trial comes my way, I'm still with God. I can still manage it and come out better for it, thanks to God. But we take that and we twist it. And that's certainly not the only scripture we do that with. We love cherry picking scriptures. And there's times that they kind of work outside of the context, but if it was meant to be taken that way all the time, we would just have a book of individual little verses, not a series of letters like we get in Philippians or histories like the books of First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings and all those. We wouldn't have it that way. God put those verses in context for a reason, but we take what God has to say and we try to make it mean what we want it to. And anytime you decide to pull a verse out of its context, you really need to make sure you understand everything that's going on around it. And I would just, as a matter of course, if you're taking that out, you're taking that to give you some kind of divine guidance, it doesn't hurt to ask for some kind of confirmation. God, am I using this right? Am I receiving the right message from you? Or am I just making this what I want it to be? So I just want to encourage you to do that. Poor Caiaphas, he didn't. He heard from God a message that Jesus would die for the nation, and he took it the way he wanted to take it. So, verse 53, from that time on, the Jewish leaders began to plot Jesus' death. As a result, Jesus stopped his public ministry among the people and left Jerusalem. He went to a place near the wilderness, to the village of Ephraim, and stayed there with his disciples. It was almost time for the Jewish Passover celebration. And many people from all over the country arrived in Jerusalem several days early so they could go through the purification ceremony before Passover began. They kept looking for Jesus. But as they stood around in the temple, they said to each other, "What do you think? He won't come to Passover, will he?" Meanwhile, the leading priests and Pharisees had publicly ordered anyone seeing Jesus must report it immediately so that they could arrest him. The stage is set. The plan that God set in motion when time began for our redemption is coming to a head. Jesus has stepped away from the action for a little while because the time's not quite perfect. We're even just a few days early would be off. Because he's not just trying to come and die for our sins. He's trying to give people every reason that he can to believe. All these things in the Old Testament, all the laws, all the prophecies, he's trying to make sure that they get fulfilled. It's not the right time yet. And even the things that that the Jews didn't typically think of as being symbolic, were highly symbolic, not symbolic, they were prophetic. Things like the Day of Atonement, things like the Passover, uh, all these feasts that the Jews were commanded to celebrate, all these things that they were commanded to do, it's all pointing straight at Jesus. And it's trying to make basically 3,000 years of Jewish history and law and everything, and make it where if people stop and look at Jesus and they look at the law and they look at Jesus and then they look at the prophecies and they look at Jesus and they look at everything that went on and they're just like, oh, oh, that's what you meant. You really were talking about him. And I can't deny it. He's trying to give them every reason to believe. Everything that their lives centered around pointed at Jesus. And people like Caiaphas couldn't get it, wouldn't get it. And the simple fact is that most of them would. And so Jesus has got things ready, getting ready to see, I guess, the final days in the book of John. A good chunk of this book is just on the last week before he died. It's just such a powerful, powerful account of what happened. I love it. But all this came because Jesus decided to step into the brokenness. He decided to raise Lazarus from the dead, not just so that Lazarus could live again, but so that we could believe. You and me, along with the people who are actually there, we could all have this extra reason to believe that Jesus is who he said he is. And not just that, even, he gave it to us so that we could have a real hope. Because he's told us that he's coming back again, that he is going to raise every Christian who's died before us, he's going to raise them back to life. And those who are still alive when he comes, well, then we get to meet him in the air. So it's going to be a beautiful time. And there's just something so beautiful about that concept that he's trying to drive home.